In early April 1961, George Blake, a senior officer in Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, arrived at the War Office building on Whitehall in central London for what he believed would be a routine debriefing. He was 40 years old, composed, carrying a leather briefcase, and about to discover that his nearly decade-long career as a Soviet spy had finally been exposed. Blake had been summoned to the War Office by telegram several days earlier. The message had been brief and unremarkable, requesting his presence for consultations regarding administrative matters. Blake had seen such requests dozens of times during his 15 years with the service. He walked through the building's main entrance, presented his credentials to the guard at the security desk, and was directed to take the lift to the third floor. What George Blake did not know as he rode the elevator upward that morning was that the administrative meeting was a fabrication. Waiting for him on the third floor were not the usual administrators, but rather a small group of men whose presence indicated something far more serious. Among them were senior officers from MI6's Internal Security Division, representatives from MI5, and a senior interrogator who had been specially selected for his expertise in handling cases of suspected betrayal. The meeting room Blake was shown into was not one of the building's usual conference rooms, but rather a smaller, more austere space. The door closed behind him. The senior MI6 officer present gestured for Blake to sit. Blake later recalled in his memoirs that it was at this precise moment, before anyone had spoken a word beyond basic greetings, that he understood he had been caught. George Blake, whose birth name had been George Behar, had been born on November 11, 1922, in Rotterdam, Netherlands. His father, Albert Behar, was a Sephardic Jewish businessman originally from Cairo who had settled in the Netherlands and converted to Protestantism. His mother, Catharina Beide-Vellen, was Dutch. George grew up speaking Dutch, French, and English, displaying from an early age the linguistic facility that would later serve him in his intelligence career. His childhood in Rotterdam was comfortable and unremarkable until 1936, when his father died of a heart attack. George was 13 years old. Following his father's death, his mother sent him to live with relatives in Cairo for a period before he returned to the Netherlands to complete his education. When German forces invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, George Blake was 17 years old. He managed to escape to England, making his way through occupied France and Spain, a journey that took several months and involved considerable danger. He arrived in Britain in early 1941 and immediately volunteered for military service. His fluency in multiple languages and his knowledge of continental Europe made him valuable to British intelligence services. He was recruited into the Royal Navy and then seconded to the Dutch government in exile, working in intelligence liaison roles. It was during this period that he anglicized his surname from Behar to Blake, a change he later said was made to sound more British and to distance himself from his Jewish heritage at a time when such heritage could be dangerous if he were captured. In 1944, Blake was sent to the Netherlands as part of British intelligence operations supporting Dutch resistance networks against German occupation. He participated in operations gathering intelligence on German military movements and coordinating with resistance groups. His work during this period was considered exemplary, and when the war ended in 1945, Blake had established himself as a capable intelligence officer with proven field experience. Before we continue with how British intelligence finally caught Blake, if you're fascinated by the hidden world of Cold War espionage and want to hear more stories about the spies who changed history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the real human stories behind some of the most consequential intelligence operations of the 20th century. Now, let's talk about how Blake's recruitment in a North Korean prison camp began one of the longest-running betrayals in British intelligence history. In 1946, at the age of 24, Blake was formally recruited into the Secret Intelligence Service. His initial posting was to Hamburg, Germany, where MI6 was establishing operations in the British occupation zone. His responsibilities included recruiting German sources who could provide intelligence on Soviet activities in the Soviet occupation zone of eastern Germany. It was during this period in Hamburg from 1946 to 1948 that Blake would later claim he first began to question the political framework within which he was operating. In 1948, Blake was transferred from Hamburg to Cambridge University to study Russian language and Soviet affairs in preparation for future postings. During his time at Cambridge, he applied himself diligently to his Russian studies, achieving fluency within 18 months. That same year, Blake married Iris Mary Peake, the daughter of a British civil servant. They had met through mutual friends in London. The marriage appeared by all external indicators to be conventional and happy. Between 1949 and 1953, they had 3 children. In October 1948, Blake was posted to Seoul, South Korea, where Britain maintained a consulate. His official role was as vice-consul, but his actual function was to gather intelligence on communist activities in the region and to monitor the deteriorating political situation on the Korean peninsula. Blake arrived in Seoul with his wife in November 1948. His work involved meeting with South Korean officials, monitoring the political situation, and filing reports to London on developments that might affect British interests. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, supported by Soviet equipment and training, invaded South Korea. The attack came without warning in the early morning hours. Within days, North Korean forces were advancing rapidly toward Seoul. The British consulate in Seoul received orders to evacuate, but the rapidity of the North Korean advance made evacuation impossible. On June 28, 1950, 3 days after the invasion began, North Korean troops entered Seoul. George Blake, along with other members of the British diplomatic mission and several civilian missionaries who had sought refuge at the consulate, was captured by North Korean forces. Blake and approximately 40 other prisoners, British, American, and other nationalities, were held initially in Seoul and then marched north toward the Chinese border. The conditions during this forced march were severe. Prisoners received minimal food, no medical care, and were subjected to physical abuse by their guards. Several prisoners died during the march from illness, exhaustion, or violence. In July 1950, the prisoners reached a camp near the Yalu River on the North Korean-Chinese border. The camp consisted of crude buildings offering minimal shelter. Food was scarce. The winter of 1950 to 1951 was particularly brutal, with temperatures falling well below freezing and prisoners lacking adequate clothing or heating. Several more prisoners died during this period. According to Blake's later testimony in his memoir published in 1990, it was during his imprisonment in this camp that he made contact with Soviet intelligence. The camp authorities provided prisoners with communist literature, works by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, as well as contemporary Soviet publications. Blake later claimed that reading this material, combined with his observations of the Korean War, led him to conclude that his fundamental political allegiance should be to the communist cause rather than to British interests. In April 1951, approximately 10 months after his capture, Blake indicated his willingness to cooperate with Soviet intelligence. A Soviet intelligence officer interviewed Blake extensively over several sessions during the following weeks, assessing Blake's motivations, his access to classified information, his position within British intelligence, and his potential value as a long-term asset. Blake was formally recruited as a Soviet intelligence asset in May 1951. He was given basic training in covert communication techniques, including dead drops, signal sites, and emergency contact procedures. He was instructed to resume his career with MI6 upon his release, to avoid any behavior that might attract suspicion, and to await contact from Soviet handlers. The Korean War continued until July 1953, when an armistice was signed. Shortly afterward, negotiations began for the exchange of prisoners. George Blake, along with other British and American prisoners held in North Korean camps, was released in April 1953, nearly 3 years after his capture. He was flown first to Tokyo and then to London, arriving on April 22, 1953. Blake's return to Britain was covered briefly in newspapers as part of the general reporting on repatriated prisoners from Korea. He was reunited with his wife, Iris, and his 3 children, the youngest of whom had been born while he was imprisoned and whom he was meeting for the first time. By all accounts, the reunion was emotional. Blake appeared gaunt and had lost considerable weight during his captivity. Standard procedure for intelligence officers returning from hostile captivity required extensive debriefing to assess what information they might have revealed under interrogation or duress. Blake underwent these debriefing sessions during May and June 1953. He described the conditions of his captivity, the treatment he and other prisoners had received, and the indoctrination attempts made by his captors. He acknowledged that he had been exposed to communist propaganda, but characterized it as crude and ineffective. His debriefers found nothing in his account to suggest compromise or ideological conversion. Blake was cleared to return to active duty. The decision to clear Blake and return him to operational work would later be identified as a catastrophic failure of British counterintelligence. But in 1953, there were no obvious indicators of betrayal. Blake had endured genuine hardship during his captivity. His account of his experiences was consistent with other prisoners' accounts. The possibility that he had been successfully recruited by the enemy while imprisoned was considered, but in the absence of specific evidence or warning signs, was ultimately dismissed as unlikely. In September 1953, 5 months after his return to Britain, Blake was assigned to MI6's Section Y, which was responsible for operations targeting Soviet intelligence activities. This was an extraordinarily sensitive assignment, involving access to information about British and Allied operations against the Soviet Union, identities of agents operating behind the Iron Curtain, and technical intelligence gathering programs. Shortly after beginning work in Section Y, Blake re-established contact with Soviet intelligence. According to procedures he had been taught during his recruitment in North Korea, he visited a specific location in London at a predetermined time and left a signal indicating he was ready for contact. Within 2 weeks, he was approached by a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in London. This officer became Blake's primary handler for the next several years. The information Blake began providing to Soviet intelligence in late 1953 was devastating in its scope and consequences. He had access to operational files detailing MI6 and CIA activities against Soviet targets throughout Europe. He provided the identities of British and American agents operating in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He revealed the locations and purposes of signal intelligence facilities. He disclosed recruitment operations targeting Soviet officials. And he provided detailed information about a joint British-American operation that was, at the time, considered one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War, a tunnel being constructed beneath the divided city of Berlin to tap Soviet military communication lines. The Berlin Tunnel operation, codenamed Gold by the Americans and Stopwatch by the British, had begun planning in 1953. The concept was to dig a tunnel from the American sector of West Berlin into the Soviet sector of East Berlin, emerging beneath a major junction of Soviet and East German military communication cables. By tapping these cables, Western intelligence agencies hoped to intercept enormous volumes of Soviet military communications, providing insights into Soviet military capabilities, deployments, and strategic planning. The tunnel's construction began in September 1954. It required digging approximately 1,476 feet from a warehouse in the American sector to a point beneath Schönefelder Chaussee in the Soviet sector. The engineering challenges were substantial. The tunnel had to be dug in absolute secrecy, had to maintain structural integrity despite the water table and unstable soil, and had to emerge with precision beneath the targeted cable junction. The operation involved hundreds of personnel and cost millions of dollars. George Blake learned about the Berlin Tunnel operation in early 1954, while it was still in the planning stages. According to declassified accounts, he was not directly involved in the operation, but his position in Section Y gave him access to briefing materials and operational summaries. He provided complete details to his Soviet handlers. The tunnel's location, its purpose, the technical specifications of the tapping equipment, and the timetable for completion. The Soviet response to this intelligence reveals the sophisticated calculation that characterized Soviet intelligence operations during the Cold War. Rather than immediately shutting down the tunnel or altering their communication procedures in ways that would reveal they knew about the operation, Soviet intelligence made the decision to allow the operation to proceed. This decision was based on several factors. First, shutting down the tunnel immediately would have revealed that the Soviets had advanced knowledge of the operation, which would have triggered a major investigation within British and American intelligence services to identify the source of the leak. Such an investigation might have exposed Blake. Second, by allowing the operation to proceed, the Soviets could control what information was transmitted over the tapped cables, using the tunnel as a channel for disinformation. Third, the Soviets calculated that the propaganda value of eventually discovering the tunnel and exposing it publicly would be substantial. The Berlin Tunnel became operational in May 1955. For the next 11 months, it intercepted vast quantities of Soviet military communications. These communications were analyzed by teams of British and American intelligence specialists, producing what was considered at the time to be invaluable intelligence on Soviet military organization, doctrine, and deployments. In April 1956, nearly a year after the tunnel became operational, Soviet and East German forces discovered it during what was described as routine maintenance work on the communication cables. The discovery was announced publicly with considerable fanfare. Soviet officials denounced the tunnel as a violation of sovereignty and an act of espionage. Journalists were invited to tour the tunnel and photograph its sophisticated tapping equipment. What was not revealed publicly, and what would not be confirmed for decades, was that the Soviets had known about the tunnel from the very beginning and had allowed it to operate for their own purposes. The intelligence gathered by Western agencies during those 11 months was a mixture of genuine communications and carefully crafted disinformation. Blake's betrayal of the operation had compromised it before it even began, but the Berlin Tunnel was only one of Blake's betrayals. Far more devastating was his systematic compromise of human intelligence operations, the networks of agents operating behind the Iron Curtain on behalf of British and American intelligence services. Throughout the mid to late 1950s, MI6 and the CIA were running extensive operations to recruit Soviet, Polish, East German, and Czechoslovakian officials who had access to classified information or who could conduct sabotage or other covert activities. These recruitment operations were dangerous and difficult. Potential agents faced execution or lengthy imprisonment if caught. Blake had access to files identifying these agents, their handlers, their methods of communication, and the intelligence they were providing. Between 1953 and 1961, according to later British intelligence assessments, he systematically betrayed this information to his Soviet handlers. The exact number of agents Blake compromised has never been definitively established. British intelligence officials who investigated Blake after his arrest estimated the number to be at least 40, though some estimates suggest the figure could be significantly higher. Many of these individuals were subsequently arrested by Soviet or East European security services. Some were tried publicly, others disappeared into the Gulag system, and some were executed. The human cost of Blake's betrayal extended beyond the agents themselves to their families. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during this period, family members of those convicted of espionage often faced persecution, imprisonment, or exile. Children of executed agents were sometimes placed in state institutions. The ripple effects of Blake's actions destroyed dozens of families. In 1955, Blake was posted to Berlin, where he served as an MI6 officer working from the British military mission in the divided city. Berlin, during this period, was the epicenter of Cold War espionage, with British, American, French, and Soviet intelligence services all operating extensively in both the western and eastern sectors. Blake's position gave him access to a wide range of operations and personnel. He continued to meet regularly with his Soviet handlers, easier in Berlin, given the city's divided status, and the relative ease with which he could travel to East Berlin for clandestine meetings. Blake's 4 years in Berlin, from 1955 to 1959, represented the height of his operational value to Soviet intelligence. During this period, he provided information on joint British-American operations, identified Western agents attempting to operate in East Berlin and East Germany, and gave Soviet intelligence detailed insights into Western intelligence priorities and methods. His wife, Iris, and their 3 children joined him in Berlin. They lived in a comfortable apartment provided by the British military. Blake commuted to his office each day, attended social functions at the British mission, and participated in the normal activities of an intelligence officer posted abroad. In 1959, after 4 years in Berlin, Blake was transferred back to London and assigned to a training role at MI6's Technical Operations School, where new officers were taught the practical skills of intelligence work: surveillance, counter-surveillance, dead drop techniques, agent communication protocols, and other tradecraft. This assignment was less operationally sensitive than his previous positions, but it still provided Blake with valuable information about current MI6 methods and procedures, which he continued to pass to Soviet intelligence. It was during this period in late 1960 that the first indications emerged that MI6 might have a serious penetration problem. Several operations against Soviet targets had failed in ways that suggested advanced Soviet knowledge. Agents who should have been secure had been arrested. Dead drops that should have been unknown to Soviet security services had been discovered. Technical operations had been countered with suspicious precision. The cumulative pattern of these failures triggered a review by MI6's Internal Security Department, working in conjunction with MI5. The investigation was complicated by the fact that many individuals had access to classified information across multiple operations. Moreover, The possibility of penetration by Soviet intelligence was politically and organizationally sensitive. The breakthrough in the investigation came from information provided by a Soviet intelligence defector, a Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski, who had been providing information to American intelligence services since 1958. Supplied extensive information about Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe. Among the information he provided were indications that the Soviets had a highly placed source within British intelligence, a source with access to operations against Soviet targets and to information about British agents operating in Eastern Europe. Goleniewski could not identify Blake by name, but he provided enough details about the source's career and access to narrow the list of suspects significantly. The investigation focused on MI6 officers who had served in certain positions during specific time periods and who had access to the particular operations that had been compromised. George Blake's name appeared on the resulting list of suspects. The decision was made to bring Blake in for questioning under controlled conditions. This was the reason for the telegram summoning him to the War Office in April 1961 and for the carefully arranged interview. The interrogation of George Blake lasted 11 days in April 1961. The sessions were conducted by multiple interrogators working in rotation, using techniques designed to break down Blake's defenses and force him toward confession. Blake was not formally arrested during this period. He was not under legal detention and could theoretically have refused to cooperate or demanded legal representation. But the interrogators made clear that the evidence against him was substantial. For the first several days, Blake denied the accusations. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that operational failures could be explained by bad luck or Soviet effectiveness rather than betrayal. But as the interrogation continued and as interrogators presented increasingly specific details about compromised operations and about Goleniewski's information, Blake's denials became less confident. According to interrogators' later accounts, Blake's confession came suddenly after 9 days of questioning. Blake had been denying involvement when he abruptly stopped, and then acknowledged that he had been working for the Soviet Union since 1951. The confession that followed was extensive but not complete. Blake acknowledged his recruitment in North Korea, his provision of information about British operations, and his systematic betrayal of agents. But he minimized the extent of the damage, claimed he had never received significant financial compensation, and characterized his actions as motivated by ideological conviction rather than personal gain or malice. When asked how many agents he had betrayed, Blake's estimates were vague. When interrogators suggested the number might exceed 50, Blake responded that he had provided information on whoever and whatever was in the files he had access to, but that he had not kept count and had not been specifically informed by his handlers what happened to the people he had compromised. Blake was formally arrested in mid-April 1961 and charged under the Official Secrets Act with 5 separate counts of unauthorized communication of classified information to a foreign power. Under British law at the time, these charges carried maximum sentences of 14 years per count. Blake was held in Brixton Prison in South London while awaiting trial. The investigation of Blake's activities continued throughout the spring and summer of 1961. Security services worked to assess the full extent of the damage. Every operation Blake had access to was reviewed. Every agent he might have had knowledge of was considered compromised and either withdrawn or, if already captured or presumed compromised, written off as lost. The damage assessment produced devastating conclusions. Blake had been the most damaging penetration of British intelligence services in the Cold War era, exceeding even the Cambridge 5 spy ring that had been exposed in the previous decade. British intelligence relationships with Allied services, particularly American intelligence, were strained because Blake's access had included joint British-American operations. The credibility of British intelligence was damaged. Operational security procedures were reviewed and tightened. Trust within MI6 itself was eroded, as officers who had worked with Blake wondered whether their colleagues might be similarly compromised. Blake's trial took place in May 1961 at the Old Bailey in London. The proceedings were held partially in camera, closed to the public, because much of the evidence was classified. Blake pleaded guilty to all 5 charges. The prosecution presented evidence of the operations Blake had compromised, the agents who had been arrested or executed, and the systematic nature of his betrayal over nearly a decade. Blake's defense attorney argued for leniency based on his client's ideological motivations and his cooperation with investigators following his confession. The presiding judge, Lord Chief Justice Parker, was unimpressed by these arguments. In his sentencing remarks on May 3, 1961, Parker described Blake's betrayal as one of the worst cases of treachery in British legal history. He emphasized that Blake had systematically betrayed agents over many years, that he had acted deliberately and with full knowledge of the consequences, and that his actions had resulted in deaths and had damaged British national security profoundly. George Blake was sentenced to 42 years in prison, 14 years for each of 3 of the 5 counts, to run consecutively. This was an extraordinary sentence by British standards and was the longest sentence ever imposed under the Official Secrets Act. Blake was 40 years old at the time of sentencing. Under the sentence, assuming no early release, he would not be free until he was 82 years old. The severity of the sentence generated some controversy. Legal experts noted that even murderers in Britain typically received sentences of 15 to 20 years. Blake's attorney argued that the 42-year sentence was excessive. The sentence stood nonetheless. Blake was initially held at Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London, a Victorian-era facility that housed convicted criminals serving lengthy sentences. Prison records indicate that Blake was a model prisoner during his early years of incarceration. He worked in the prison library, taught himself Arabic and Hebrew, and maintained regular correspondence with his mother. The revelation of Blake's double life had devastated his wife, Iris. She had known nothing of his espionage activities, had believed completely in his loyalty to Britain, and now faced the reality that the man she had been married to for 13 years had been systematically betraying his country throughout their entire marriage. She visited him occasionally during the first year of his imprisonment, but found the visits increasingly difficult. In 1961, the same year as Blake's trial, Iris filed for divorce. The divorce was finalized in 1962. Iris received custody of their 3 children and reverted to her maiden name. She declined all interview requests about her former husband and made deliberate efforts to shield her children from public attention. Blake's imprisonment might have been the end of his story, but on October 22, 1966, 5.5 years into his sentence, Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs Prison in what became one of the most famous prison breaks in British history. The escape had been planned over several months with assistance from outside accomplices, individuals who had become sympathetic to Blake or who opposed his lengthy sentence on political grounds. Blake, working in the prison garden during afternoon recreation time, used a makeshift ladder to climb over the prison's outer wall at a point that was briefly out of sight of guard towers. Outside the wall, accomplices were waiting in a car. Blake dropped from the wall, sustaining injuries in the fall, but managed to reach the car before alarms were raised. The accomplices drove him to a safe house in London, where he remained hidden for several weeks. The escape triggered an immediate and intensive manhunt. Police and security services searched extensively for Blake, assuming initially that he would attempt to reach the Soviet embassy in London. But Blake and his accomplices had made different plans. In December 1966, approximately 2 months after his escape, Blake was smuggled out of Britain, concealed in a camper van. The van traveled through France and West Germany, crossing multiple borders with Blake hidden in a specially constructed compartment. In East Germany, Blake was transferred to the custody of Soviet intelligence officers and transported to East Berlin, and from there to Moscow. Blake's arrival in Moscow was not publicly announced immediately. It was not until May 1967, 7 months after his escape, that the Soviet government publicly acknowledged that Blake was in Moscow and had been granted political asylum. The escape and Blake's successful flight to Moscow were deeply embarrassing to British authorities. They prompted a comprehensive review of prison security procedures, particularly regarding prisoners serving sentences for espionage or other national security offenses. The individuals who had assisted Blake's escape were eventually identified and prosecuted, receiving prison sentences of 1 to 3 years for aiding a prisoner's escape. In Moscow, Blake was given an apartment, a pension, and employment in a role that involved training Soviet intelligence officers in British and American intelligence tradecraft and procedures. He was decorated by Soviet authorities for his service to the Soviet Union, receiving the Order of Lenin and other awards. He married a Russian woman named Ida, with whom he had 1 son. By accounts from those who knew him during this period, Blake lived comfortably in Moscow and appeared to have no regrets about his choices. Blake's 3 children faced profound difficulties in the years following their father's arrest, trial, and escape. They were adolescents and teenagers when their father's espionage became public. They faced harassment at school, social isolation, and the psychological challenge of reconciling their childhood memories with the public reality of a man who had systematically betrayed his country and had caused the deaths of dozens of people. The children carried their father's name and legacy into adulthood. According to various sources, all 3 struggled with the psychological impact. They faced difficulties in education, in careers, and in personal relationships. The stigma of being the children of Britain's most notorious Cold War traitor affected their life trajectories in ways that extended far beyond their control. None of Blake's children maintained a relationship with him after his escape to Moscow. They declined his attempts to correspond with them and made clear they wanted no contact. When asked in later years about their father, they uniformly declined to discuss him publicly. This complete severance of family ties represented perhaps one of the most profound personal consequences of Blake's choices, the permanent loss of relationship with his own children. Blake's wife, Iris, had to rebuild her life as a single mother with 3 children, facing the social stigma of being the former wife of Britain's most notorious Cold War traitor. She worked to support the family while dealing with the psychological trauma of her husband's betrayal and imprisonment. According to later accounts, she struggled with depression and anxiety for years. She never remarried and lived quietly until her death, declining all interview requests and making every effort to live outside the shadow of her former husband's notoriety. The families of the agents Blake betrayed faced even more devastating consequences. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where many of these agents were arrested and executed, their family members faced persecution, interrogation, unemployment, and surveillance. Children grew up knowing their parents had been killed as traitors to the state. Wives and husbands faced years of harassment and economic hardship. In the closed and punitive societies of the Soviet bloc during this period, association with someone convicted of espionage could destroy lives even when family members were entirely innocent. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but Blake remained in Russia. The new Russian government, despite significant political changes, continued to grant him protection and support. Blake gave occasional interviews to journalists and wrote an autobiography titled No Other Choice that was published in 1990. He lived in relative obscurity in Moscow. In these interviews and in his memoir, Blake consistently defended his actions as having been motivated by ideological conviction and by opposition to what he characterized as Western imperialism and militarism. When asked about the agents he had betrayed and the deaths that resulted from his espionage, Blake's responses followed a pattern of minimizing personal responsibility while acknowledging theoretical regret. In one interview, he stated that he did not think he had consciously betrayed individual men, but rather had betrayed the system. In another interview, he acknowledged that it would be dishonest to say he never thought about the people who died, but maintained that in war, which is what the Cold War was, casualties are inevitable. These statements reveal the moral framework Blake constructed to justify his actions to himself. By characterizing his espionage as serving a higher ideological purpose, and by framing the Cold War as a genuine war in which casualties were inevitable, Blake avoided direct confrontation with the reality that he had personally caused the deaths of specific individuals who had trusted Western intelligence services. The question of Blake's motivation remains contested and complex. Blake himself consistently portrayed his espionage as driven by ideological conviction developed during his imprisonment in Korea. He claimed he became convinced that the Soviet system, despite its flaws, represented a more just and peaceful approach to organizing society. This self-portrayal served Blake's psychological needs. It allowed him to frame his betrayal as a form of political dissent rather than simple treachery. But this self-portrayal is not entirely convincing. While Blake's compensation from Soviet intelligence was indeed modest, several £1,000s over many years, he did receive payment. His espionage was not purely ideological. Moreover, Blake appeared to enjoy the sense of importance and secret knowledge that came from his double life. A more complete understanding of Blake's motivations probably requires acknowledging multiple factors operating simultaneously. Ideological sympathy with communist ideas developed during his imprisonment, resentment of what he perceived as British and American imperialism, the psychological gratification of feeling important and valued by his Soviet handlers, the intellectual satisfaction of successfully deceiving WWII, and perhaps some element of personality that found the risk and duplicity of espionage inherently attractive. None of these factors justify or excuse Blake's actions, but understanding them is necessary for understanding how a person becomes capable of systematic betrayal over many years, how they rationalize the harm they cause, and how they live with themselves afterward. George Blake died on December 26, 2020, in Moscow, at the age of 98. His death was announced by Russian intelligence services and was covered extensively in British and international media. Obituaries described him as one of the Cold War's most damaging spies, a man who had betrayed more agents and caused more damage to Western intelligence than perhaps any other single individual during that era. The obituaries also noted that Blake had lived to see the complete transformation of the world he had spied for. The Soviet Union he had served had collapsed in 1991. The communist ideology he claimed to have embraced had been largely discredited. The Cold War he had participated in had ended not with the triumph of communism, but with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. Blake himself, in his final interviews before his death, acknowledged this historical irony. Asked what he thought about the collapse of the Soviet Union, he reportedly responded that he remained convinced his actions had been justified, but acknowledged that history had not unfolded as he had expected. The British government's response to Blake's death was notably restrained. Officials declined to comment substantively beyond acknowledging his death and noting his conviction for espionage decades earlier. The general sense seemed to be that Blake belonged to history, that his Cold War betrayals were artifacts of a vanished era. But for the families of those Blake betrayed, his death likely brought more complex emotions. Some of the agents Blake compromised in the 1950s had children who were still alive in 2020. These individuals had grown up without parents who were executed or imprisoned because of information Blake provided to Soviet intelligence. For them, Blake's comfortable life in Moscow, his awards and pension from Soviet and Russian authorities, and his peaceful death at age 98 represented a profound injustice. The comparison between Blake's fate and the fate of those he betrayed is stark. The agents he compromised faced arrest, interrogation often involving torture, show trials, lengthy prison sentences in brutal conditions, or execution. Their families faced persecution, economic hardship, and social ostracism. Many of these victims died young. Blake, by contrast, lived to 98. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews. He received awards from the governments he served. He remarried and had another child. He lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, to see the end of the Cold War, to see the world transform. The question of whether this disparity represents a failure of justice is complicated. Blake was convicted, sentenced to 42 years, and served 5.5 years before escaping. He then lived the remainder of his life as an exile, unable to return to Britain, separated from his children, living in a foreign country whose language he had to learn as an adult. But for many, particularly for the families of Blake's victims, this punishment seemed inadequate measured against the harm Blake caused. There is no way to calculate or balance these accounts. Blake took specific actions that led to specific deaths and destroyed specific families. No punishment he might have received could have undone those consequences or restored those lives. The broader significance of the Blake case extends beyond the particular operations he compromised and the particular agents he betrayed. Blake's success in penetrating British intelligence and remaining undetected for nearly 8 years revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in Western intelligence security during the Cold War. These vulnerabilities included insufficient vetting of personnel, particularly regarding psychological vulnerability to recruitment and ideological conversion. Blake's experience as a prisoner in North Korea should have triggered more intensive security review before his return to sensitive work. The procedures for such review were inadequate. The vulnerabilities also included inadequate compartmentalization of information. Blake's access to operations he was not directly involved in was broader than necessary for his job functions. Stricter need-to-know principles would have limited his ability to compromise operations outside his direct responsibilities. There was also insufficient monitoring of personnel for behavioral indicators of compromise and cultural resistance within intelligence services to the possibility of serious penetration. The assumption that British intelligence officers were loyal to Britain by virtue of their background and training created blind spots that sophisticated adversaries could exploit. These vulnerabilities were not unique to British intelligence. American, French, West German, and other Western intelligence services faced similar challenges and experienced similar penetrations during the Cold War era. The Blake case, along with other major espionage cases, prompted comprehensive reforms in vetting, security, and counterintelligence across Western intelligence communities. But the Blake case also raises broader questions about loyalty, ideology, and moral responsibility in the context of the Cold War. The Cold War was an ideological conflict between two fundamentally different visions of how societies should be organized. Both sides in that conflict believed they were defending important principles. Both sides engaged in extensive intelligence operations. Both sides recruited agents from the other side. Both sides compromised operations and betrayed individuals. But this moral relativism breaks down when we confront the specific human consequences of Blake's actions. The agents Blake betrayed were individuals who had agreed to work with Western intelligence, often at great personal risk, because they believed in the causes of freedom and democracy, or because they opposed the specific injustices of communist governments. Blake's betrayal of these individuals led directly to their arrests, their torture, and in many cases their executions. Moreover, the systems Blake betrayed these people to, the Soviet Union under Stalin and later Khrushchev, the Eastern European communist governments of the 1950s, were genuinely repressive, authoritarian regimes that violated human rights systematically and that punished dissent brutally. Whatever ideological principles Blake claimed motivated him, the practical effect of his espionage was to strengthen these repressive systems and to help them identify and destroy individuals who opposed that repression. The challenge in evaluating Blake's legacy is to hold multiple truths simultaneously. It is true that the Cold War was a complex ideological conflict in which both sides believed they were defending important principles. It is true that intelligence services on both sides engaged in morally questionable activities. It is also true that George Blake systematically betrayed specific individuals who trusted Western intelligence services, that his actions led to their deaths and to the destruction of their families, that he did this knowingly and deliberately over many years, and that he lived comfortably afterward while his victims suffered and died. George Blake died in Moscow on December 26, 2020, at age 98, maintaining to the end that his actions had been justified by ideology and principle. The dozens of agents whose names he provided to Soviet intelligence died decades earlier, arrested, interrogated, executed, or imprisoned in labor camps. Their children grew up without parents. Their families faced persecution. Blake lived to see the Soviet system he betrayed Britain for collapse and be discredited. He received awards, wrote memoirs, granted interviews, and lived comfortably in exile. Whether Blake genuinely believed his own justifications, or whether they were psychological defenses against confronting what he had done, we cannot know. What we know is the documented record: the operations compromised, the agents betrayed, the families destroyed, and the damage to British intelligence that lasted a generation. Blake was 40 years old when he was arrested, 43 when he escaped to Moscow, 98 when he died. In between, he lost his family, his country, and any possibility of return. His victims lost everything, and the system he sacrificed everything to support collapsed before he died, rendering his betrayals and their sacrifices equally, tragically meaningless. The recognition that betrayal of this magnitude does not announce itself with obvious villainy, but is carried out through the routine application of access, the systematic exploitation of trust, and the psychological capacity to disconnect actions from consequences, this remains the most unsettling aspect of the George Blake case. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of espionage in the modern era. It requires not dramatic action or conspicuous treachery, but simply the daily choice to betray, rationalized and compartmentalized, repeated until it becomes habit, justified until the justifications themselves replace any honest confrontation with the human cost of what has been done.